Cat Days by Griffin Rose on AO3. Episode 29, Chapter 4. Hey, brother. Shouta had filed Shinso's case and pulled some favors to get it processed ahead of schedule. Even then, though, Shinso couldn't have gotten a straight answer on the whole adoption thing. He presumably started looking into it. It was much more smoother process than it had been with Izuku, particularly because he adopted Izuku. He had a track record speaking for him now. They still had to come up out of the apartment and do some background checks and some other fun stuff, but there wasn't a lot to worry about. Izuku filled up several boxes worth of donations from stuff in his room, and Shota's tests did that funny acting it often did around his son. There was some stuff he was willing to put into storage, but he didn't want to get rid of it, so they pushed it into an empty corner of Shota's room. He'd always been a minimalist, so he had the extra space. He didn't want to commit to buying bunk beds just yet, still turning over the idea of moving into a bigger place altogether. Hisashi, on the other hand, took Izuku and went out with him on Saturday morning. The delivery came that afternoon, and they spent that night putting it together and trying not to kill each other. You couldn't have asked for installation? Shouta grumbled, rereading the instructions for the 10th time. He couldn't remember what step they were on. It didn't seem that hard, Hisashi protested, looking at the two metal bars and measuring them against each other. Do you think these are the J pieces? Izuku plucked the pieces out of Hisashi's hands and put them back down. No, those are for the ladders. We don't need them yet. Unsurprisingly, Izuku was the one who had any sense of what to do with all of this. Not that he knew exactly what he was doing, but he was less clueless than Shouta or Hisashi. Shouta was more than happy to let them take the reins. He was never letting Hisashi buy furniture alone again. Izuku had to sleep in the living room that night. They were planning to finish it on Sunday, and Shouta had just finished a third cup of coffee and felt ready for the task when there was a knock on the door. He'd never been more thankful for unexpected company. I'll get it, he said. Start without me. Hisashi barked a laugh. You wish. Shouta checked the peephole. He would have done a split take if he'd still been drinking. Shinso stood on the other side, hoodie pulled over his head, and a face mask on. His eyes were red from crying. He yanked open the door. Shinso, what's going on? Are you okay? Shinso didn't say anything as he entered. He didn't make eye contact either, staring off to the side. Shinso? Izuku asked, hovering in the hallway outside his room. Shinso's eyes flared up briefly. Before him, he lowered his hood. Shouta sucked in a breath. It wasn't a face mask. It was a muzzle. He wanted to punch someone. Izuku made a keening sound and hurried over. Let's get this off, Shouta said, and warned Shinso before he reached behind his head. There was a cheap lock securing the clasp. They locked him into the damn thing. Those bastards would be lucky if all he did was punch them. He took a deep breath. Okay, onto the kitchen. Izuku and Hisashi picked up on his tone, and Shinso flinched, but let Shouta guide him into the kitchen. He pushed Shinso into a chair. I'll get my lockpicks. Hold tight. Your what? Hisashi hissed, eyes zeroing in on the lock. Oh, those sons of a... Shouta slammed a hand over his mouth and dragged Hisashi along with him to his room. I know it's hard, but we need to stay calm. Hisashi dragged his hand over his face, jaw tight. I know, I just can't believe anyone would do that. This is why we're getting him out of there, Shouta reminded him. He grabbed his hero uniform from the top of the dresser and rifled through the belt until he found his kit. If I have it my way, he'll move in today. Legally be damned. I have no objections to this, Hisashi assured him. We'll call it an extended sleepover if anyone asks. Shouta snorted. Works for me. They went back out to the kitchen. Izuku had grabbed the first aid kit, for some reason, and had it already on the table, and he looked up at them with an edge of panic in his eyes. Shoot. Was Shinso injured too? Shouta hadn't noticed any injuries. Shinso had been limping, or favoring either side. He didn't see blood. Maybe Izuku was just being paranoid. He made short work of the lock. Any amateur could likely jam it with a paper clip, it was so flimsy. But even if Shinso knew what he was doing, it would be hard to maneuver his hands behind his head that way. They threw the lock into the trash, and Shinso ripped the muzzle off his face. Blood smeared his cheeks, leaking from the cuts he had gotten last week. The muzzle had reopened them. Fresh tears rolled down Shinso's cheeks, even as Izuku started wiping his face with alcohol wipes. "I'm sorry," Shinso said. "I knew I was bleeding and they wouldn't take it off. I didn't know what else to do." "You did good coming here," Shouta said, putting a hand on his shoulder. He watched as Izuku handed the first aid kit, cleaning up Shinso's face and carefully laying plasters over the bleeding scalps. He must have been able to smell the blood. "When was the last time you ate?" "Dinner last night." Shinso shrank in his chair a little. It was almost noon now. The kid had to be starving. Had he even had anything to drink in all that time? Hisashi was on the same wavelength, because he offered a glass of water before Shouta could even ask. Shinso downed it, while Hisashi started making a sandwich. Izuku picked one final plaster, and then went about cleaning up. He did so silently, but tensely, lines of anger tightening his shoulders. He'd never been one to anger easily, and the few times Shouta could think of had always been on someone else's behalf. It didn't even occur to Shouta until Izuku put the first aid kit under the sink again that he probably should have taken a photo of Shinso's bleeding face for evidence in his case. He frowned and kept the thought to himself. He wasn't about to rip the plasters or do it now. They still had the muzzle and the lock. As much as he wanted to destroy both things, they'd go a long way to proving their case. A sandwich was placed in front of Shinso, and he quietly thanked Hisashi before taking a bite. Izuku tapped his fingers on the counter. Shinso eyed him warily, waiting for the next explosion Izuku was clearly building up to. Shouta kept a hand on Shinso's shoulder, gently rubbing little circles with his thumbs. "We're not letting him go back there, right?" Izuku asked, glancing at Shouta and Hisashi. Hisashi laughed and shook his head. "Not a chance." "But they're still my legal guardians," Shinso said. "I have to." "They won't be for much longer," Shouta stated. "You can stay here until we get everything sorted." "We better finish the bed." Izuku grabbed Hisashi's arm and dragged him back to his room. Shinso stared after them, and then looked up at Shouta. "Bed?" Shouta took the seat next to him. Hisashi was excited that you might move in, and jumped the gun on getting a bunk bed for Izuku's room. It hasn't even been a week," Shinso murmured softly. "Like I said, he was excited. We all are. Whatever you decide." Shinso rubbed at his eyes, careful of the band-aids resting just beneath them. "No one's ever wanted me before." A familiar pain bloomed in Shota's chest, and he leaned forward to wrap Shinso in a hug. "We want you, Shinso. I promise you, we really, really do." Shinso hit his face and Shota's shoulder, breath catching on a silent sob. He cried for a few minutes before agreeing to stay with them however long they had him. "I'm thinking forever, kiddo," Shouta said. "Just so you're aware. But I'd understand if you can't believe that yet." He understood, but it still hurt. There was a metal clang from Izuku's room, and then Hisashi swore loudly in English. The cats scrambled out of their Vitus hiding spaces and raced around the house. A moment later, Hisashi came stumbling into the kitchen, cradling his hand, and made a beeline for the freezer. "How's it going?" Shouta asked. Hisashi glared at him. "Shush." Izuku came out of his room, a new hole in his shirt that raised all kind of questions. "Sashi's not allowed to work on the bed anymore." Shouta snorted. "Do I want to know what happened?" "No," Hisashi stated. He pressed an eye patch against his fingers. Giving Shinso one more squeeze, he let go of him and stood up. Alright, let's see if I can figure this out. Shinso offered to help too, while Sashi watched from the doorway. Shinso provided to actually know what he was doing rather quickly, scanning the directions and pieces around them. The first thing he noticed was that they used the wrong pieces on the bottom bunk, so they had to deconstruct what they've done the previous night. After that, things went smoothly, and they had a solid bunk bed standing by dinner time. Hisashi and Shouta tested it, since they weighed more than the kids, climbing onto it and wiggling around to make sure it held. Alright, I think we're good to go, Hisashi said, climbing back down. Who's hungry? They asked Shinso which type of takeout to get. And while Hisashi ordered it, Shouta got to work updating the League's investigators on Shinso's case. The muzzle and the lock disappeared into a bag to be handed over later. After dinner, he'd take Shinso back to that house to get his things, and then hopefully Shinso would never have to see those foster family again. Izuku ended up taking the top bunk. He would have preferred the cave-like qualities of the bottom bunk, but Shinso pointed out that he typically went to bed later and was more restless, getting up far more often in the middle of the night, so it made more sense for him to be on the bottom bunk, so he wouldn't disturb Izuku so much. Shoving all his blankets and stuffed animals to the top bunk, Izuku recreated his nest as best as he could, curling up in the softness. Shinso turned off the main light and crawled into the bottom bunk, his phone casting a soft blue light around the room a few moments later. They were both quiet for a while, and Izuku was on the cusp of sleep when Shinso spoke up. You awake? Hmm? Can I ask you something? Sure. When Aizawa adopted you, why didn't you take his name? The edge of sleep retreated, and Izuku opened his eyes to his dark room. I didn't really think about it at the time, and he didn't ask. I didn't think it occurred to either of us until later. Shouta had been pretty hesitant about adopting Izuku. Hisashi had confided to him years later that the idea of parenting, quite frankly, scared the crap out of Shouta. But he'd been willing to do it for Izuku. You could have done it later, if you wanted to, though. Right? Yeah, probably. Izuku agreed. But it's just never been a big deal to either of us. He's my dad, and Hisashi's my uncle, and our names don't change that. That makes sense, I guess. Shinso said. Izuku waited for him to say more, but the silence persisted. Do you want to change your name? I don't know. Shinso replied quietly. My birth parents loved me, but they died in a car crash before my quirk manifested. I like to think it wouldn't have bothered them as much. I'm sure it wouldn't have, Izuku said. My name is all I really have of them, you know? That and a few pictures. There's nothing wrong with keeping your name, Izuku told him. I know, but part of me wants to take Aizawa's name too, and fully be a part of his family. Izuku could understand that. Every now and then he regretted not taking Aizawa's name, when his insecurities peaked. But then all he had to do was snuggle with Shouta, and he remembered Shouta had chosen him, and he wanted Izuku in his life. You're a part of this family no matter your name, Izuku said gently. Shinso didn't respond for a few minutes, long enough that Izuku wondered if he actually fallen asleep. He almost drifted off before he heard a soft, "Thank you." Izuku smiled into his pillow. The adoption was finalized a week later. The investigation of abuse was ongoing. Shinso's foster parents denied ever using a muzzle on him, and claimed he locked himself into that thing, and that this was all bid for attention. Shouta kind of wanted to let Hisashi loose to scream at them, or let Izuku cause some psych damage by sneaking around their house, as a rodent or a snake, but he managed to control his petty side and settled for hounding the adopting agency to move faster. It paid off. On the last day of the final exams, everything was finalized, and Shinso was officially his son. He showed Shinso the paperwork, hiding his smile in a scarf. Shinso had to wipe a tear from his eyes again, but he wore the biggest smile Shouta has ever seen on him. For a moment, just a moment, with that wide smile and the bandage over his bridge of his nose, Shinso looked so much like him. Shouta couldn't breathe. There were still adjustments to be made. They all had to get used to living with one another, and Izuku had to adopt to sharing a room for the first time. They were doing well, and none of their little arguments that popped up over were to hang out a new poster or when time to turn off the lights were very serious. Given time, they'll all adjust. Of course, now he and Izuku were leaving for 2 weeks on the summer training camp, but hopefully Shinso would be able to settle in without them. Hisashi had promised to do some training with Shinso when he could, and Shinso seemed to be looking forward to it. Shouta had never planned on having kids, but he couldn't deny that there was some of the best things that had happened to him in his life. The muzzle pained me. The muzzle pained me. Ugh, I'm glad that he's finally safe and sound. I kind of low-key wish that we got a little Hisashi lore and it'd be like, oh, Hisashi used to be on a muzzle. Like, they used to put a muzzle on Hisashi, which I love some of the fics with that premise. I do. I like, as I said before, I like the premise of a muzzle on his Hitoshi, not because I genuinely want to see him in pain, but because the dynamic of having a muzzle and the intricacies it could do for storytelling and implementing stuff like that is really, really interesting. I mean, when we're put into this new realistic fantasy world, or not even just realistic, just fantasy world, it is really interesting to see the different types of discriminations humans pull out, because believe it or not, humans are shitty people sometimes, most times actually, but as I said, it's nice to see some of the racism that could carry over if it's like a fantasy world where there's different races, stuff like that, you know. And I've always found it quite interesting and intricate to be able to look at that and fully acknowledge that and fully go through with it and fully like explore it in a narrative standpoint, especially with My Hero Academia, because it's not just, you know, it's quirkism, and I love when it's not just because if you're quirkless. Sometimes it's, oh, you're quirkless, so you're the bottom of the scum, and then next to the bottom of the scum is villainous quirks, people with villainous quirks. You are horrible, horrid, and whatever. And then after that is people with mutation quirks, like, oh my god, you look like an abomination, but that one isn't as potent and as strong as the other two. And obviously there's people with weak quirks for some reason. I've always, you know, loved how that can go hand in hand, how the statistics of that can even differ between fan fiction to fan fiction. There's some fics where as long as you have a quirk, you're good. And then there's some fics where I find it really interesting where it's like, okay, you have a quirk, but you know, it's a villainous quirk, but hey, at least you're not quirkless. At least you're not treated like them. They're not even treated like human. They're treated like absolute garbage. At the very least, you're treated like a human kind of situation. You know, pick your poison kind of choose. So this is really interesting, and I really can't wait to find out what the rest of this is gonna entail. I really hope that obviously that those foster parents lose their license to be able to foster, because as Shouta said, you don't know, like, they don't know when they're gonna get another kid with a quote-unquote controversial quirk, and that's gonna happen. Okay, so next one is chapter 5, Tests Aren't Just Grades. It's time for final exams, and Izuku is facing more challenges than just a test. Then he thinks he could relax at the mall. He should have known better. Okay, so we're going after those two. It is a very longer chapter than before, so I think we're gonna stay with this chapter for like 4 to 5 episodes. If we're doing our before I gave you guys the presents, that probably would have been 10 to 15, around there, roughly 10 to 15, but we're not, and this is a new one, so hopefully we'll speed by through this faster, or who knows, maybe it will take 10. So okay, as always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.